Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second ZeroHedge debate.
Yeah, I actually think what Destiny and what Ed are saying are very important. First of all, I was going to say that I think one of the problems with how these things are debated is that a lot of people these days have very binary prisms for understanding things. A lot of that comes from YouTube debate where you have to declare yourself on one side or the other. So Destiny said, oh, everybody either hates this insurrection, thinks it's an insurrection, or they deny it happens, or they think it's good. And there's so much middle ground. Namely that for me, this was a political protest that spilled over into a riot where a small minority of the people engaged in violence. I don't think we want to urge that to happen. We don't want to defend that. I consider that lamentable. But the fact that it's laughable to call this an insurrection is actually demonstrated by the examples that they're using. This was a 3-hour riot that was extremely easily subdued. It doesn't remotely compare to any prior insurrections, let alone to the Civil War. The only people who were killed on January 6th were 4 people, all 4 of whom were Trump supporters, 2 of whom dropped dead of a heart attack and 1 from a speed overdose, because these were not exactly a well-trained militia. And when Jack Smith went to charge Donald Trump with multiple crimes, he had a lot of options to charge him with, and he charged him with a lot of crimes, including very dubious ones. He did not charge him with inciting an insurrection for reasons that I think we ought to ask ourselves why. But the fact that this is such a minor event in history is demonstrated by the fact that the media, who needed this to be a major event, immediately started lying about what happened, saying that Brian Sicknick was murdered when he had his head bashed in through a fire with a fire extinguisher, only to learn that actually he called his mother that night. He was fine. He died the next day of what the coroner said were natural causes, because the media knew that if you can't say that even one person supposedly perpetrating the insurrection killed anybody, pulled out a gun, let alone discharged a weapon, all of which is true, it's a joke to call this an insurrection. At best, it's a riot. And that's the reason why Trump hasn't been charged with an insurrection. The only time he ever commented on January 6th about whether he thought there should be violence or not was when he said the following. He said, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. He urged them to be peaceful in how they went there. To the extent there was violence, I think you can make the argument that the FBI informants that even the New York Times admits were there were the ones that urged it. But even if the people who were there were the ones responsible, at best this is a riot. You could so easily make the case that the 2020 riots was a far greater insurrectionary threat than anything that happened on January 6th. I actually want to ask a question that I would love to hear everybody's answer to. But before I do that, just want to say about federal judges. This year, in the last 6 months, 4 different federal judges, a district court judge, and then an appellate court unanimously found that the Biden administration gravely violated the First Amendment. In fact, the greatest assault on free speech, the court said, in decades, maybe the history of the judiciary, by systemically pressuring big tech to censor the internet and purge it of all dissent by threatening big tech companies using the CIA, the FBI, and the CDC with punishment if they didn't censor the internet. Now, you may not agree, but according to your standard, 4 different federal judges concluded that, which is infinitely worse in terms of an abridgment of freedom or an attack on the Constitution than anything that Trump is accused of doing.
That's
but in terms
true.
of whether
that's true.
Well, that's your point, and then we're going to move on to the response.
The question I want to ask is, the question that you asked, Ian, is this a coup? If you look at how other coups are perpetrated, and I think a lot of this is that if you're an American and you have this very soft history, you don't know what a coup is, you think that like what CNN tells you a coup is a coup. Usually the way coups work is the leader of the country or whoever is in charge of the military orders the military to seize control of the levers of power. Trump was the commander-in-chief on January 6th. The military was duty-bound to obey his orders. They had a right to disobey if they were illegal, but if this were a coup, why didn't Trump order the military to seize control of the power and turn over the election process to him? Why didn't he order the armed factions that form the law enforcement part of the military and the executive branch that serve under his command to do that as well? That's what happens in a coup. That didn't happen here because Trump wasn't trying to perpetrate a coup.
He wanted...
January 6th committee, and it's what Alex was alluding to just a second ago, is one of the biggest shams in the history of Congress, because what happened with the January 6th committee was we had a long history of 225 years of tradition in the United States Congress where whenever investigative commissions would be created within the Congress, the minority leader and the majority leader would each select the members of that committee to ensure there was fair representation by both parties. Nancy Pelosi, for the first time in the history of the United States, as Speaker of the House, refused to allow the Republicans who were chosen for that committee by Kevin McCarthy, at the time the Republican minority leader, to be seated on the panel. And as a result, the Republicans said, we're going to have nothing to do with this. And the only quote unquote Republicans that were chosen was Liz Cheney, who ended up losing her seat by 36 points, and Adam Kinzinger, who didn't bother running again because they were so unrepresentative of the Republican Party. It was a completely partisan commission. And on top of that, none of the videotapes that were available was made available to the public except for very deceitfully chosen snippets by Adam Schiff and by Liz Cheney. And it was only within the last several months that we saw all of the video footage, and what it showed makes a joke of the idea that this was a coup. You had people peacefully walking into the Capitol, led by many of the police officers who encouraged them to enter peacefully, which they did. The vast majority of people who were there at January 6th aren't even charged with using violence, and that's what makes this whole debate such a preposterous joke. If you look at how coups are carried out in other countries, you could make a much better case that the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 was an insurrectionary movement. And the reason it matters, Destiny, is because if you're going to make arguments, there has to be an important test, which is, do you apply the same principles you're claiming to profess and believe in to cases where it undermines your partisan allegiance and your ideology, not only where it helps it? That's one of the key tests for determining the authenticity of your argument. And so if you don't think the 2020 protest movement was an insurrectionary movement against the United States government, there's no way to claim what January 6th was, especially since Trump could have done so much more to cause a coup that he did not do, because that wasn't his aim ever. Do it in 7 seconds. If Trump believed genuinely that the election was stolen, then all of those steps that he undertook to try and present the Congress the way to alleviate the stolen election, to have courts reverse the stolen election, to have Mike Pence exercise what he thought was his constitutional authority, might have been wrongful, but they weren't illegal, and they most definitely weren't a coup. Well, I only heard the last 4 minutes of the conversation, but I'm still always amazed by, I really don't understand the argument, because the FBI and the U.S. security state before January 6th was saying that they regard the greatest threat to national security not as being ISIS or Al Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah or China or any other foreign threat. They regard the greatest threat as being right-wing domestic extremists, in whom that was included on many lists: the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, and all of the people in the groups that they said orchestrated January 6th. Is the argument that you think that the FBI was not monitoring and infiltrating those groups? Because there's actually a ton of evidence that the FBI had their hooks in all three of those groups, and not only had their hooks in them, but on January 6th had informants on the ground who were pretending to be Trump supporters, who were talking in real time to the FBI about everything that was happening. So I just want to understand what the claim is. Is the claim that the FBI was not involved in the groups that organized January 6th and didn't have informants with them that day?
They weren't instigating. That's your claim.
It came out that the vice president of the Oath Keepers was an FBI informant. The Proud Boys had at least 3 and as many as 8. And the New York Times itself reported that there were FBI informants in the Proud Boys who were inside the Capitol texting their handlers as the event unfolded.
The whole context for this conversation is, again, I mean, you just keep going back to it because it's so easy to see. People have this idea of the FBI like, oh, they don't do this sort of thing. Earlier, I think it was Ed who said, wait, why would the New York Times run a pup piece? Do you think they're working with the FBI? Like, that idea to him is so different.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. It was me.
No idea what the history of the FBI is in this country. They have no idea that the FBI throughout the entire war on terror did this over and over. They would target and entrap all sorts of vulnerable Muslims to engage in plots that the FBI created in order to create a narrative that the FBI was needed because there was a much bigger threat of Islamic terrorism than there actually was. The FBI has been infiltrating and then using provocateurs to encourage groups to commit crimes so that the FBI can gain more power, can spread this narrative. You have to be incredibly naive or only paying attention to the news since 2016 and thinking Donald Trump is the only issue, not to understand that this is what the FBI has been doing for decades. And so to have this like naive attitude like, oh, is the New York Times working with the FBI? That is what the media in this country has been doing.
But you have no evidence of it. You're just making theories up.
By the way, if I can just add a nice little colorful detail there, the author of the Ray Epps puff piece that asked none of the questions that would get to the core of his involvement there. It's total puff piece. You can read it yourself. The author of that, his previous work, includes the CIA authorized account of the Sinaloa cartel.
Yeah. The whole thing, like listening to them, honestly, it's like listening. I don't mean to be insulting. I'm just saying this, it's what it sounds like 7th graders who learn civics class and have this understanding of how the US government works. Like, oh, the FBI investigate and they discover crimes and then they go to the courts and the courts are very honest and the courts are apolitical and the courts make rulings and everything that has happened in January 6th, and you can even look at the people they picked and choose who to expand the law, the people who ended up getting prosecuted on felony counts, even though they were nonviolent, had these incredibly novel interpretations of law that were used against them to turn nonviolent demonstration and nonviolent political protest into felony by taking this post-Enron law and giving it a stretched meaning that it never had before. And the reason so many of them plead guilty is because they know that if they go into court, they're going to have rulings against them because a lot of these judges, especially in Washington, are not only Democratic Party judges, but the entire system is furious to watch people go and put their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. So the entire system decided that this has to be punished regardless of what the law provides. You had the FBI with their hooks inside all of these groups, but I do understand that if you believe in this story of American propaganda, that the FBI is these upstanding law enforcement people and they don't do that, and then the courts go and make rulings, then you're going to end up with this image of what the three of them have, which is this idea that this was one of the worst attacks in American history. The courts have ruled. Everything the government did in this case is consistent with their longstanding view before January 6th, that these groups are criminal groups. They need to be criminalized. Trump's movement is a threat to the United States, and the entire part of January 6th was designed to define them as an insurrectionary movement so that they could criminalize them, which is exactly what they're doing. That they wanted to turn right-wing extremists into domestic terrorists. And they used January 6th and this extremely inflated narrative about it, what it was. It was a riot of out-of-control people, a few hundred of them, that they turned into an insurrection, that they're now weaponizing the justice system, and they're creating a precedent. I hope you guys understand this, where they're now taking a nonviolent protest. Remember, most of the people charged in January 6th are charged with nonviolent protests, and they've made it now so that they can charge those people with felonies and put them in prison for years. That was the Q shaman, 4 years in prison for a nonviolent protest. That's the precedent that you're endorsing with this narrative. Just ignored all the evidence we've been presenting for the last 2 hours, including the fact that the FBI, by their own admission, had informants in all three of the leading groups that organized January 6th and were talking to informants on the ground at the Capitol.
Exactly.
On that day.
Who is the head of the FBI?
Appointed him, it's okay.
As far as the January 6th defendants are concerned, it is true that they're getting sentences similar to what people get when they're charged with felonies. The point is that it is insane that nonviolent protesters are being charged with felonies in the United States. That is what never happens. And pointing to Black Lives Matter is not to say, oh yeah, that's whataboutism, so we're admitting that this was an insurrection, and that is too. The point is that what the government is doing, if you look at the disparate treatment between the two, is picking and choosing which movement they like ideologically and politically and which they don't, and punishing much more severely the one that they don't, which is what January 6th is about.
Go for it, Glenn.
When Black Lives Matter happened, every single blue state mayor and every single blue state governor weighed in on the side of the rioters because they were petrified of being demonized as being racist if they didn't support everything the Black Lives Matter movement did. So yes, the Black Lives Matter movement had corporations sponsoring them. They had Kamala Harris urging and raising money for people to get out of prison who were imprisoned and prosecuted for having engaged in violence as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. The entire establishment was on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement. The entire establishment hated the January 6th defendants. That's the reality of our government that you don't understand.
The reality of our government that you don't understand.
My name is that Ed and Brian and Destiny have to actually live through a real coup so that they can then come back to the set and be like, oh my God, you know what? I'm so sorry for saying that what happened in the Capitol for 3 hours against the most militarized and powerful government to ever exist in human history got anywhere near a coup or an insurrection. A coup or an insurrection. A coup is generally when people in power or people who are trying to get into power marshal the force of the armed factions of that country and use it to eliminate the legal process and take over. So So, for example, if Trump had called in the military on his side on January 6th, or he had gotten the military to block people from trying to remove him from office on January 20th, that is always what we say is a coup. Nothing that looks like what happened on January 6th. The other thing I just want to correct, Destiny seems to have this like debate me sort of point that he thinks he keeps making that's so smart, which is when you say—
Why does he waste so much time on catty comments? There must be something better for him to say.
No, you're the one that does throwaway lines.
All right,
better for him to say.
we're about to change gears. Let Glenn finish this thought, and then we're moving to our audience questions.
Has done this little debate tactic like 8 times. I've listened to it for 2 hours. So if you say this person did this and it's wrong, and then someone else says, well, what about this person, this politician you love? He did the same thing. Destiny says, oh, you're admitting that both of them did something wrong. No, one of the reasons why you say things like the Black Lives Matter protest was never considered an insurrection is not to say that January 6th was also an insurrection and therefore you should treat the Black Lives Matter one like an insurrection. The point is to say the Black Lives Matter wasn't treated like an insurrection because people like Ed and Destiny and Brian love the Black Lives Matter movement because it's unaligned with their ideology. These are liberals who hate the Trump movement politically and therefore want to criminalize it. But pointing to other examples—
I'm against all rioting, just to be clear.
Isn't admitting that the one that you start with is wrong. You're just trying to show that you're not applying consistent principles when your ideology is at stake.
If that was the case, then when you're
it's really given like a kind of amazingly vivid mindset into the minds of Trump-era liberals who have really come to see the U.S. security state and the courts and prosecutors as their political allies in their war that they're waging against people who disagree with them. And they have this like very romanticized view of what the FBI is, what the DOJ is, how the court systems work, how the federal government works. And all of this reveals this so well because what's happening here is so manifest, which is that all of these agencies are being abused because the Trump movement is considered the gravest threat to establishment power in this country, which is why the bipartisan establishment is against it. To try and make this about Alex and Sandy Hook is a really pathetic way to end the debate. I think you guys have done a good job defending your views. I think you should leave it at that.